The cell was wet, and it smelled like old iron and older things, and I had been there for what I could count as 11 hours, if the light that came through the high window was any guide. I had also been there for 3 days before that, waiting to be seen, which I had spent believing that if I was patient enough, and if I explained properly, someone would understand that I had done the right thing. That was before they put the manacles on me. Before a woman looking at me like I had personally insulted her bloodline said the word thief. And I did not understand what she meant. And then I understood. And then they were taking me down stone stairs. It started 4 days before that, in a river, in the morning, with a piece of gold that did not belong in the water. My name is Renna. I was 22 years old, and I had never been more than 9 miles from the village where I was born, which is in the high valleys and is so small that we do not have a name that people outside of it recognize. We measure distance by weather. We are 2-day storms north of the Carden, 1 spring melt north of the Ashford. That is how people locate us. We have a river, though. It comes down from the stone passes, and it is cold, and it is where you wash things, and where you catch the trout that are the only thing we have much of. My father fished it. My mother washed in it. My whole family has stood in that water at some point and called it home. I was washing cloth on the morning of the first day, my mother's cloth, the winter linen she had woven through the autumn. Pieces of it that needed the river's work to come clean, and I had my hands in the water up to my elbows. And I was cold, and I was thinking about how we were going to afford wool for the winter, and something came down the river that made the water catch the light in a way the water never did. It happened so fast I almost missed it. A glint, golden, brighter than anything my valley had ever held. It came around the bend where the current is fastest, and I saw it, and I did not think I just moved, and I put my hand out and caught it, and the cold took my breath. It was a ring. I want to describe it, because it matters, and because I carry it now, and I see it every day, and I want you to understand what I was holding in that river. It was gold, which I had never touched in my life. The colour was wrong for my valley, too bright, too definite, too much. Wide at the base and narrower at the band, and it had a symbol on it that I did not recognise. A lion. A crown. And something else, smaller, underneath letters maybe, or something more complex. The work on it was so fine that I could see each hair on the lion's mane, individually, as though the smith had spent a day just on the mane alone. Each stone in the crown was individual. Whatever the smaller thing was, it was detailed enough that it required a jeweller's hand, and that jeweller's time, and that jeweller's skill. I stood in the river with that ring in my palm, and I understood, standing there in water up to my elbows in a valley that had no name, that I was holding something that had a story, and that the story was not a small one. I dried it on my apron. I kept it dry in the folds of cloth. I walked home with it in my pocket like a secret. And then I made a decision that in retrospect was going to change everything. I was going to return it. It is not the kind of decision that makes sense to people who have options. If you have options, if you have trade or family wealth or any path at all to something better than what you have, you do not spend 3 days walking to a place you have never been to return a piece of jewellery. But I did not have options. What I had was a ring that clearly belonged to someone who had lost it. Someone who was missing it, someone who was probably still looking for it, and a knowledge that if I lost something irreplaceable in a river, I would hope someone would care enough to walk back and try to find me. So I walked. 3 days. No cart, we do not have those. No horse, we do not have those either. I had bread and a wrapped cheese, and a waterskin and shoes that were barely holding together. By the afternoon of the second day, my feet were bleeding into my socks. By the morning of the third day, I had stopped being able to feel them properly, which was probably a mercy. I wore out more than half my souls on those roads. The ring I kept in a cloth at my chest, inside my dress, where nothing could take it from me, and where I could feel it against my heart and know it was still there. By the time I saw the palace at Windgate at the end of the third day, I could barely walk straight. The gates were enormous, and there were more people standing in one place than I had seen in my entire life. And I walked up to them with my feet bleeding and my dress in pieces and a ring in my hand that was worth more than every single thing my valley had ever produced. It was enormous. Nothing in my village is enormous. The largest thing we have is the stone pass, and that is made by stone, not by people. This was made by people. It was meant to impress, and it impressed me like being struck by a large thing in the dark. There were guards at the gate. I had expected there to be guards. I had not expected them to be the size of mountains, or armed with things that looked like they had been designed to kill a great many people very quickly. I held the ring out. My hands were shaking, and I do not know if it was from the road or from understanding what I had just done. I said, "I found this in the river at the North Pass, and I have walked 3 days to return it to the palace." I want to be honest about how they looked at me. It was not disbelief. Disbelief is when you do not think something is true, and what I saw in their faces was something more complex than that. It was a kind of understanding that I had presented them with something that did not fit any category they had for things in the world, and that it was my fault for not fitting into a category that would have made sense to them. A girl, dirty, wearing clothes that were worn through at the elbows and the knees from the road, bare feet showing through torn socks, holding a ring that was clearly made of gold and clearly worth more than every single thing I had ever owned in my entire life. Telling them a story that could only mean one of two things. Either I had done an impossibly kind thing, or I had done something very clever and was executing a plan to cover my theft. In the world these men lived in, one of those things was impossible and one was logical. "Come," said the larger guard, and I came. They did not take me to the palace. They took me to a room adjacent to the gatehouse that had the specific feel of a space designed for temporary holdings. There was a bench and a small window that looked out at a wall. There was a bucket. There was a woman waiting, and she had the air of someone who had asked the same questions many times and had learned not to expect answers that made sense. She was a scribe, I think, or something like a scribe. She had a ledger and a quill, and she asked me questions for what felt like a very long time. Where did I find it? Exactly when? How many days ago? What river? What village? What was the name of the village I told her? She did not write it down, which I noticed. Why had I come to the palace? Did I think someone would pay me for it? Did I have anyone who could vouch for me? My father's name, my mother's name, my family's standing, the village's relationship to the crown if we had one, which I did not think we did, whether I had ever been arrested, whether I had stolen anything before. I answered every question. I tried to be clear. I tried to be convincing. I tried to explain the rightness of what I had done. And with every answer I gave, I felt something going wrong that I could not name, as if my answers were somehow making the situation worse instead of better. By the time she was done with me, the light had gone from the window, and I realized it was evening, and I had been awake and walking and explaining myself for more than a day. Exhaustion was starting to make my answers worse. I knew it. I could hear it. And I could not stop it. They gave me a cot in that room, and they locked the door, and I slept, because I had walked 3 days through the high passes, and then another day and a half to the palace, and my body had no choice about it. The morning of the second day, someone brought me bread and a cup of thin broth, and took it away an hour later without asking if I had finished. The bread was harder than my teeth, and I did not have the energy to soften it the way you have to. So I sat there with it in my mouth and could not eat it. In the afternoon, I was taken to a larger room, still not grand, but larger, with windows on two sides and a table that the woman from the night before was sitting at. She was not alone this time. There was a man with a scar on his face and a bearing that suggested he held some kind of authority, and he looked at me the way you look at a mathematical problem that is not solving correctly. They asked the same questions again. I answered them again. But this time, halfway through, the woman interrupted me. "Surely," she said, "you understand how this appears." "I found it," I said. "I walked 3 days." "A girl from nowhere," she said, and she said it with the kind of certainty of someone who had seen through many lies and was convinced I was telling another one, presents herself at the gate with a piece of jewellery that is clearly worth more than her entire village's annual tax. "And you expect us to believe she walked 3 days out of what kindness? Moral principle? Moral principle." She said it the way a person says a word for something that does not exist. I did not know how to answer that. Moral principle seems like a very grand term for what I had, which was simply this: the ring was not mine, and someone was missing it, and I had the ability to return it. And doing the thing you are able to do that is right is not a complicated decision. It is only complicated if you have reasons not to do it. But I could not explain that to her in a way she would understand, so I just said it again. I found it. I walked 3 days. "Why?" said the scarred man. "Would anyone do that?" And I had no answer that made sense to them. By the end of the second day, I understood with terrible clarity that I was not going to be believed. That no amount of explanation was going to move them from the fact they had decided on: a poor girl with a valuable ring must be a thief. The explanation I was giving them did not fit into their understanding of how the world worked, and so instead of accepting my explanation, they were deciding that I must be lying. It was not until the morning of the third day, when they brought me manacles, that I understood I was going to be tried for theft. It was not until they brought a guard who would not meet my eyes that I understood I was going to hang for it. If you want to know what the Alpha King of the Windgate was actually doing for 3 years, with the ring his mother left him because it was never lost, and it was never truly stolen, and a girl from nowhere was about to die, for returning it, stay with me, and follow along, so you do not lose the thread. It gets much worse before it gets kind. The Great Hall was the largest room I had ever seen, and I have tried very hard not to think about it in detail since, because even now it feels like the room is a living thing that is watching me and keeping track. There was a raised dais at one end. There was a judge sitting at a long table, a man whose job I did not understand until the second day of that trial. There were guards, I counted 9 of them, when I was being brought in, though I may have been wrong about the count. And there were about 30 people in that room, seated in a gallery along one side. And I realised, midway through the proceedings, that every single one of them was here to decide whether I was going to be hanged. The ring was on a table between the judge and me. They had put it on a black cloth, displayed like a piece of evidence rather than what it actually was, the single most important thing I had done in my life. I was asked to explain myself, and I did. I explained about the river in the North Pass, and the way the light had caught it. I explained about the walk the 3 days, the roads, the feet that bled into my socks, the way my body felt lighter by the 3rd day, because it had nothing left to give. I explained that I did not know who the ring belonged to, but that it clearly belonged to someone, and that I had done what I thought was right, and that I had thought it was right, because I would have wanted someone to do the same for me. Every person in that room looked at me the way you look at an animal that is doing something you do not understand. Not with cruelty. With the kind of distance that comes from not being able to imagine your mind working the same way their mind works. The judge said they would need to see the king. That is the word they used, the king, as though he were being summoned for a minor matter that required his personal attention. As though a girl in manacles and a ring that did not match any story they could imagine was something that rose to the level of his concern in a kingdom that presumably had borders and treaties and a great many things to do. I had never seen a king. I had never been more than 9 miles from home. I was not certain what I was expecting. I think I was expecting someone who looked certain about things. Someone who you could see had never been wrong. What I got was a man who came down the side of that hall with one other man at his shoulder, a large, fair-haired warrior with a scar, and who stopped dead when his eyes landed on the ring on the black cloth. He did not say anything. He did not move. He just stood there and looked at it the way you look at something you thought was gone from the world forever, and that you have given up hope of ever seeing again. And his wolf, I had not realized there was a wolf in that room, lying against the wall in the shadows, got up. Slowly, deliberately, it walked across the entire floor of that great hall, stepped over the place where I was standing in manacles, and put its head down directly over the ring on the black cloth. Then it looked at me. The whole room went very still. "Your Majesty," the judge said, carefully, as though he was speaking to a man who was not quite present, "we have a matter of theft to present." The king did not seem to hear him. He was still looking at the ring. The second came up beside him and said something very quietly. I could not hear the words, and the king did not respond. The second said something again, and still the king did not respond. The king was looking at the ring the way a man looks at a ghost. Then his eyes came up and landed on me, and I understood, in that moment, that I had been convicted not because anyone in that room actually believed I was a thief, but because the only alternative to me being a thief was something that was much harder for them to accept. That there are people in the world who will walk 3 days to do the right thing. That kindness still exists even in a poor village, with no name and nothing to offer but labour and faith. "How?" he said, and his voice was very quiet in that enormous room, and it was the most dangerous thing I had ever heard. "Did you come to have this ring?" And I told him. I told him about the river, how the light had caught it. I told him about the decision to return it, though I do not think I explained that part well, because I still do not know how to explain why you do a thing that costs you everything when you could have done nothing and been fine. I told him about the walk. I told him about my feet. I told him about arriving at the gates and showing the ring to the guards, and believing, right up until they put manacles on me, that I had done something right. And I watched his face while I told him. I watched him understand that I had done the right thing and had been imprisoned for it. Watched him understand that for 3 days I had been accused of stealing something I had walked 3 days to return. The voice that came out of him was not loud. It was much worse than loud. It was quiet, so quiet that I had to strain to hear it, and it was the voice of a man whose control had just cracked across its entire length. "You walked 3 days," he said, "to return something that was not yours. Yes, my lord. To a place you had never been. Yes, my lord. From a village with no standing and no resources, and no reason for this palace to care about it. Yes, my lord. And they put you in chains for it. There was no way to answer that. I had been in chains. I was still in chains. I was about to be hanged for returning something that was not mine, and nobody in that room seemed to think that this was strange." The king of the Windgate looked at the judge. He did not say anything. He simply looked at the judge, and the judge went very white, and stood up, and left the hall without ever finishing the trial. Then he looked at his second, and said, very quietly, "Remove her manacles." The wolf did not move from the ring. It stood over it like a guardian, and it looked at me, and it did not shift its weight when the second came near with a key. The animal was saying something with its body that I did not have words for, some kind of acknowledgement, some kind of recognition. It was the first moment in 3 days that anyone had treated me as though I had done something right instead of something wrong. When my wrists were free, the skin was marked where the iron had been. Deep grooves. Dark. The flesh underneath raw. They hurt in a way that made me understand, physically, how long I had been in those manacles, how close I had come. The king looked at the marks. He looked at me. And then he said something to his second that I did not quite hear. I think it was, "Get her out of here before I do something to this room that cannot be undone." And the second nodded and stepped toward me. And the king said to me directly, his voice still that dangerous quiet come, "If you want to know why a king walked a girl out of a great hall in front of 30 people and then did not stop walking, and what he was carrying that made him walk like a man who was holding something that might break at any moment, stay with me. This gets better, but it takes a while to get there." He took me through the great hall and out a side passage and down a corridor and into a small room that was not a cell. It was not a grand room. Either it was small, and it had a single window and a bench and a basin of water. But it was a room for someone who was not a prisoner. There was water and cloth, and someone, a woman, I think, though I was exhausted, and everything after the great hall is a little blurred, brought food, and did not take it away after an hour. He did not come back that day, or the next, but his second did, and his second came with clothes that fit me, and with careful questions about the village. Did I have family there? Were they well? Did they have enough? Was there anything they needed? Why? I asked, on his third visit, my voice starting to come back from wherever it had gone when I realized I was going to hang. Does he want to know all of this? Because, said the second, whose name was Rolf, and who had a kindness in his voice that I had not expected to hear from anyone in that palace, he is planning to do something about it, and he wants to know what he is planning to do. By the time the king came to see me, I had been in that clean room for 5 days. My wrists had stopped actively hurting, though they would carry marks for months. I had stopped being afraid, and had started being confused instead, which felt like a mercy. He came in the evening, and he closed the door behind him, and he sat down on the edge of the bench, not far away, not close enough to threaten, but close enough that I could see his hands were shaking. "That ring belonged to my mother," he said. "She wore it for 40 years. When she died, I kept it with me. And when I was 26 years old, I took it down to the river to think about her. It was something I did once a season. I would go to the river where she used to walk, and I would sit there, and I would remember her. That year, when I was 26, I was not careful. I took the ring off to clean it in the river, and the current took it. The current took it, and I could not find it, and I have looked for it every year since. And I have found nothing but river stones and loss." He stopped talking. He looked at the wall for a long time. 3 years, he said, 3 years of searching, and a girl I have never met walked 3 days to return it. I did not know what to say. An apology seemed wrong. A celebration seemed worse. "I am sorry it was lost," I said finally. "Do not apologize to me," said the king of the Windgate. "I did not do what you did. You did something kind when you had nothing and nobody was asking, and there was no reward, and it would cost you everything. I spent 3 years angry about having lost something, and you walked 3 days to return it to a stranger." He stood up. He looked at me for a moment. He left. And that was the last time I was alone, until they came and got me ready for what came next. It was not a sentencing. It was a binding. And it was public, in that same great hall where they had tried me for theft, and the king stood up in front of everyone who had accused me and said that I was to be in his household, and that anyone who questioned it could leave. 2 of the judges left. One of the guards objected and was removed, and the rest of them stood there and watched a king put his hand out to a girl who had walked 3 days to return his mother's ring, and had been imprisoned for it. The kiss came later, in a place where nobody was watching, and it was one breath long, and it was not what I expected, which is that nothing in me caught fire. Something in me set down. 3 days of walking with bleeding feet. 3 days of imprisonment for doing the right thing. 3 years of him looking for something he had lost, and believing it was gone, forever put down at once. A year on. This is what my life is. The ring sits on my hand now. The band fits me perfectly, which Aldrich says is statistically improbable, and therefore proof of something he will not quite articulate, but which I think means he believes some things are meant to find their way back. The lion is still there, and the crown, and the smaller symbol underneath his mother's initials, which I have learnt to read. The village is different. Aldrich sent builders, and a road that connects us to the trade routes, and a tax remission, and a healer with training, none of which anyone asked for, all of which arrived in the spring after the trial. The whole village treats it as though it is my doing, a girl from the village who walked to the palace and came back a queen. But it is his doing, and it is his way of saying that a kingdom where a girl can be imprisoned for the right thing is a kingdom that needs to change, and that he will spend whatever it costs to see that it does. His second Rolf married one of the palace stewards and visits the village twice a year. He comes back with stories about my mother and my father, and brings gifts that I have to stop him from bringing, because the abundance of it makes them uncomfortable. They are not used to having, and the wolf, the animal that recognized his king's mother's ring before his king did, that moved to protect it, and then moved to protect me, lies across the foot of our bed and refuses to leave any room I am in. Aldrich has stopped trying to convince it to move somewhere else. He stopped when he realized the wolf was not guarding the ring. It was guarding me. So tell me, was he wrong for 3 years to be angry about losing something instead of trusting that the world still had kind people in it? He says yes. I say the loss and the anger were the same thing, and that he needed to go through one to arrive at the other. We have argued about it for a year, and neither of us has moved, and I would like some outside opinions. Tell me your theory below, and if you want to know what happened when the judge who called me a thief came to court asking for a pardon, because that is a whole other story, and Aldrich handled it in a way that might surprise you, comment the ring. And stay with me. Aldrich and I are not finished. Follow along, and I will tell you that one too. And wherever you are listening from tonight, if you find something that is not yours, the hardest thing you can do is the right thing. Walk 3 days. Do it anyway. You have no idea how much it might matter to someone you have never met.